looking today at Ezra chapter 3. Ezra chapter 3 it gives us some insight in how some of the materials of the temple travel down the coast along from Lebanon, from Tyre and Sidon down to Joppa. I'm going to read just a few of the verses from Ezra chapter 3. Then they gave money to the masons and carpenters, and gave food and drink and oil to the people of Sidon and Tyre, so that they would bring cedar logs by sea from Lebanon to Joppa, as authorized by King Cyrus of Persia. Excuse me. The materials that the temple was going to use were particularly resourced from a place further to the north, and Lebanon was involved in the whole process. So it was interesting that the authorization of King Cyrus was essential for this to happen. And so as a result, a trade treaty, an agreement happened. There was employment, there was opportunity, and there was an involvement of those people that were not Jewish people, were not part of God's people. They'd never been part of Israel and Judah, and they were instrumental. If they hadn't been involved, it would never have happened. Interesting trade routes sometimes are part of God's plan. The gospel gets to go to places because of trade routes very often. Some of those trading partnerships and relationships aren't always positive ones. There can be all sorts of different things going on, but they can also be part of God's plan. And here we see something that feels like it's a very specifically divinely ordained plan, that they would be supplying materials, not just sort of anything, but stuff that was particularly going to be used for the temple. And we find that God is drawing people into his purpose. He's drawing people into being part of his bigger plan in lots of ways, and he doesn't exclude those who might not look like likely candidates, in the first place. Those who at the beginning are not obviously kind of God's people. They don't seem to have a religious heritage. They don't seem to have all the credentials. But it's interesting how there's a desire in the heart of God for all nations, all peoples, all sorts of individuals from all sorts of backgrounds. And that's the bigger heart of God. And when Jesus stood up and spoke in Nazareth in his ministry, we see that in Luke 4, and he talks about how there's this incredible desire of the heart of God, that he's always been looking out to reach beyond the borders of Israel. He'd always been looking out to reach those who are not already the household of God, those who were the outsiders. And he cites different examples of that. And of course, the crowd is incensed, and they're thinking like, this is out of our box. We can't cope with this. We can't cope with a God who wants to reach out. But it's strange because Galilee, the part of the country where he came from, was called Galilee of the Nations, because it was a kind of crossroads. So lots of trade traffic and people movement was happening, going from Asia to Africa, and also over towards people going up then over towards Europe as well. So it's kind of a bit of a crossroads area for key trade routes, and that's where Jesus announces this, and we see that also in the book of Isaiah. The people in walking in darkness have seen a great light, and it talks about Zebulun and Naphtali, the tribal areas of Israel in that part of the country, were key places where everybody knew that they were quite international, they were quite cosmopolitan. They were places where there would be people coming through from all sorts of places. Interestingly enough, Israel is also an incredible crossroads for migratory birds for exactly the same reason, because it's a kind of land bridge. So God has placed this temple, has placed these people in an important place, but also it's given the opportunity for them to have this connection. And you look through the Old Testament, through the Bible, it's very clear that God was always speaking to his people to be very careful about the kind of agreements they made, the kind of dependence they made. And they were vulnerable. They had Egypt to the south, they had the Babylonians and Assyrians. Obviously, they invaded. You have a lot of history, and if you go into Israel today, there's lots of different empires and historical phases where different groups had come and had a political and military power over the land. So they were in quite a vulnerable place. But this is an opportunity where God has used all those things and used them for a blessing. And so I want to pray that wherever we are, we may not understand that God's placed us in an important place. It might not be somewhere we feel is important in our own eyes or in the eyes of other people, but God's placed us there for a reason, and He's placed us there very strategically as well. And I want to pray that we would really be aware of that today and see God's great plan, maybe for your neighborhood, for your town or city or nation where you are, that God's placed you in that particular location for a reason. And He wants to involve that place with His greater purposes for His glory. I was listening to a call yesterday, or on a call with some friends abroad, and it's a really heartbreaking story. And I'm praying for real sense of peace, but also for God to move in the situation. A lovely couple who'd gone to do Christian work in quite a remote village, really, and the lady just died, and really heartbreaking situation for them. And yet, I think there's a tremendous sense of longing to see God's purpose fulfilled there, and for the locals to see, to understand the quality of the lives of the people who poured in their heart and soul and had made a real big difference to this village as well. They'd really helped turn around a business, and they'd made a big impact. And I think of some other friends that we met in France where they'd gone to a little village. They didn't really have a lot of experience, but they'd ended up being involved in vineyards, because that's what everybody did. Everybody had like vineyards, and in the end, the chap was the head of the kind of cooperative of different vineyards, and he made a big influence, a big impact on the whole little valley where they lived, and it really felt like God had put them there. Quite an obscure sort of place, very, very small place. We went to visit there, 600 people, so it's a very small village, but he was there for a reason, and his family were there for a reason. And another friend of ours ended up buying a house in that village too, and that's why we were able to go and visit. So I pray that God would use you, and so wherever you are, don't underestimate God's plan and purpose for it. Jesus was in Nazareth, and people said, did anything good come out of Nazareth? And he was born in Bethlehem in Judea, a very small place, but the prophet Micah talks about it. And so it's not necessarily that what other people think about where you're from. It's what God thinks He wants to do in that place and in that situation. So bless you, and I pray today you'd have a fresh understanding of God's great plans and purposes, not only for you as an individual, but for you, your family and so on, but also for the place where you live, that it's not forgotten, and there's a great purpose that God has to involve that place in His amazing glory and His wonders and His enormous plans So bless you and the neighbourhood where you come from.